Call the meeting to order for the January 24th study session. Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
The record will reflect that all members of council are present.
Wonderful. We're going on to current business. The first item is clarification of items on the consent calendar. Councilmember Kleinman, do you need any clarification regarding any items?
I do not.
Councilmember Stapleton?
None.
Councilmember Grant?
No.
Councilmember Wygant?
No.
Councilmember Avery?
None.
Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill? None. And I need none. Thank you. Next item is going to be an overview of the inclusionary housing ordinance.
Good afternoon, Mayor Blum and City Council Member Simone Jurgis, your Community Development Director. With me, I have Jaime Murillo, who's our Principal Planner, and Kathy Head, who's our consultant with Kaiser Marston. So this afternoon, we want to talk about the inclusionary housing ordinance, and I just want to say a few words before I hand it off to Jaime. So we know the state of California is mandating a massive amounts of affordable housing, and they're mandating and requiring all cities to plan for those levels of affordable housing. We've had to, because of the state, put affordable housing in our housing element that recently got certified. That housing element now has policies in place that talk about what is that minimum requirement for a city to require affordable housing. Again, the state has mandated the opportunities. Now they want to mandate the construction and the development of affordable housing. An inclusionary housing ordinance simply is that minimum requirement for affordable housing. We're not here because we want to be here. We're here because we're trying to implement our housing element. There's that policy in there that says you shall adopt a housing element ordinance within 3 years from certification. We've talked to you once before, a year ago. That was prior certification, and now we're talking to you again. It is a confusing subject. I completely understand that. One of the questions we always get, what's the difference between an inclusionary ordinance and density bonus? Well, density bonus is voluntary. It's not required by the development community or developer. So if a developer just chooses not to utilize the density bonus provision of state law, how does the city of Newport, or how does any city, mandate affordable housing development? And that's what the inclusionary ordinance is. That's just that basic minimum to say you will always add affordable housing or we'll provide you an in lieu fee. What we've done is we've hired Kathy Head from Kaiser Marston to study Newport Beach because we're unique. Our land values are different in different parts of town, and she's provided us with the results of her study. What you'll see, what Jaime will present, is our basic recommendation. Our recommendation is minimal, very minimal, and we're coming in and saying, what's your thoughts, City Council, on adopting a minimal approach on the inclusionary, or would you like us to do something different? So that's just a little bit of background of why we're here, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Jaime. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you for the overview. Good evening, Mayor Baum, members of the council. I'm just going to dive a little deeper into this topic of inclusionary housing. So staff did present at a study session back in September of 2021, an overview of inclusionary housing. And this was when we were in the early process of updating our housing element. The consensus from the council at that time was to come back, study the financial impacts that an inclusionary housing ordinance may have on housing development in the city, and develop a recommendation for a percentage that could be supported. And so we returned to the council in March 2022. We engaged with Kaiser Marston and Associates to prepare that financial impact analysis, and we shared the results of that analysis with the City Council. However, at the time, there was uncertainty whether or not our housing element would actually be found compliant by HCD. A lot of cities, including ourselves, were having a hard time getting that approval from the state. But we're happy to report that in September of last year, the City Council did adopt a housing element that was found compliant. And so now that we do have 4 new council members, we are returning with this topic and seeking council feedback. But as Simone mentioned, a real basic overview of inclusionary housing is an ordinance that would require any new housing development to include a set percentage of the number of units for affordable housing. So in this exhibit here, you can see if a developer were to propose a 100-unit apartment complex without an inclusionary housing ordinance, there's no way for the city to mandate any of the units be affordable. However, with a 10% inclusionary requirement, then at least 10 of those units would have to be set aside for low-income housing. And as Simone mentioned, why is this important? And it's important because the city has spent a lot of time and effort in developing our housing element update to address the state's mandated regional housing needs allocation for the city. This is an extraordinary number that was assigned for Newport Beach, and approximately 3,600 units the city is required to plan for to be affordable through moderate to very low income housing. And so to try to meet that goal, the city's housing element includes rezoning strategies that would rezone up to 10,000 new units in the city. And the intent of that is that some percentage of that would be developed for affordable housing. But without an inclusionary housing requirement, there's really no way to ensure that any of these new housing opportunities that we're creating would actually be developed for affordable housing. And so this is really a tool that cities can use to mandate some of that new housing opportunity is set aside for affordable units. It also helps disperse affordable units throughout the community in the different housing projects that are built instead of concentrating housing in like 100% affordable housing projects. And it is also a housing element policy. It's policy action 1K in the adopted housing element. And that policy actually states that the city should pursue adopting an interim inclusionary housing policy within 6 months of adoption. So that'll actually be coming up this March. And the interim policy does state to adopt an inclusionary requirement of 15%. Now that we've done the financial impact analysis, as Kathy will share, we actually believe that 15% requirement is too high, and that would actually result in a financial impact in housing development in the city. So it's our recommendation that we actually omit adopting that interim 15% policy and just moving forward with a permanent policy with a more supportable percentage, which would be lower. And we'd have 3 years to adopt that. Simone mentioned density bonus. That's another tool that the city can use. It's actually a tool created by the state of California. We've recently updated our density bonus ordinance to comply with state law. This tool would allow a developer to boost density within a project based on what percentage of affordable housing units they include in their project. To help accommodate that boost in density, it also allows them development standard waivers, incentives, and reduced parking. So this is an optional tool. It's totally voluntary, and it's up to the developer. But if a developer chooses not to use density bonus, then an inclusionary housing ordinance is a mandatory requirement that the city can adopt. And the framework for that inclusionary housing ordinance is completely to the discretion of the city council. And so as part of that framework, we would have to decide what types of projects this inclusionary requirement would apply to, the minimum percentage of inclusionary, like how many units would have to be set aside, or what percentage. Do we want to allow alternatives such as the ability for a developer to pay an inclusionary housing fee in lieu of actually creating the units on site? It can also include other alternatives such as off-site construction, preserving at-risk units that are already affordable but their covenants are going to expire, or even land donation. And the two can work together. And I think this is important to note that, for example, if the city had a 10% inclusionary housing requirement, that 10% inclusionary requirement would automatically make that developer eligible for a density bonus. The density bonus is based on a sliding scale, but as shown on this slide in the middle table, 10% low-income units, if they were provided, would net a 20% density bonus. So now that project would be entitled to 20 additional units on top of their original project. However, if a developer chose to not build the units on site and opted for some alternative that we had, such as paying an in lieu housing fee, they would not be eligible for a density bonus. Now, I also wanted just to highlight, the city used to have an inclusionary housing ordinance. It was repealed in 2013 when our regional housing needs for the fourth planning cycle was very low. We only had a RENA of 5 units total. And so there's really no need for an inclusionary ordinance at that time. But just for reference, it was a 15% inclusionary housing requirement, but it only applied to for sale projects. So that'd be like condominiums. And the only reason for that is at the time there was a court case that stated an inclusionary housing requirement on rental units violated a rent control act. But that's since been resolved, and the courts and the legislature have now resolved that issue, and an inclusionary ordinance is legal for both rental and ownership housing. There was an in lieu housing option or fee, which it started at $18,500 and increased annually based on changes in new home prices. And at the time the ordinance was repealed, it did escalate to approximately $29,000 per market rate unit in a project. And it did include the various alternatives such as offsite construction, land dedication, and offsite conversion. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Kathy Head. She did prepare the financial impact analysis. That analysis is posted online on the city's website at that website indicated on the slide.
Okay, this button? Okay. Good afternoon, council members, mayor. My name is Kathy Head. As been mentioned, I'm president of Kaiser Marston, and I've been working with the city of Newport Beach for many years in a variety of capacities as a financial consultant. But what I'm here to talk about today is the inclusionary housing study financial evaluation that I prepared last year when we came to the council at that time. And I'm just going to give you a very brief summary, and we're here to answer any questions you have when I'm done. So the primary feature that the courts have told you about how to do inclusionary, because this had been an issue in the courts and in the legislature for really decades, and so it finally got to the California Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that you can do inclusionary housing as a city or a county, and that it's not a taking, and that it's not subject to the Mitigation Fee Act. So that was a big case that came down. The other thing that came down then soon after that was, as Jaime mentioned, is the repeal of the prohibition against providing inclusionary housing requirements for apartment or rental projects. So those two things happened in the late teens. And then, so a lot of cities, in addition to the fact that everybody had housing elements to do, a lot of cities either reinstated inclusionary housing programs or adopted new inclusionary housing programs. The key factors that the courts have told you is that well, first off, you just want to balance the unmet need for affordable housing, so the public good of providing affordable housing, but against the need for a developer to make a profit from a project they're developing, because if they don't make a profit from the project they're developing, they won't develop the project. And so it's a balancing act between the need that you've been assigned by the state versus needing to have development of all kinds happening in order to achieve that affordable housing. So that's a balancing act. What the courts told you is the requirements cannot be confiscatory, and the requirements cannot deprive an owner of a fair and reasonable return on their investment. Now, they conveniently did not tell you what that meant. So you have a situation where every jurisdiction who's doing a financial evaluation needs to do their own analysis, whether they do it in-house or they hire a consultant or they throw darts at it. There needs to be some notion that you're not creating this confiscatory or depriving an owner of a fair and reasonable return. And so that's the purpose of the Kaiser Marston analysis in this case, is to look at what requirements could be imposed while creating that balance that I talked about. And so the two measures that I looked at when I did the analysis here is clearly when you do an inclusionary housing requirement or any kind of affordable housing requirement, it's going to have an impact on development economics. It just by definition, it will have that. And so then the question is, how much of an impact can it have before you create the two measures that the Supreme Court told you not to do? But also, the state has also told you that they're looking at everybody who's doing inclusionary housing and saying, we don't want you to create a constraint to housing. So you also have that requirement as well. So you have the state looking at you, you have the Supreme Court looking at you. You certainly have the developer community looking at you. So the two measurements that I looked at in this analysis is, how much would land costs have to go down to cover the lost income? So, because it's going to cost the same amount of money to build the project, no matter what. So the variable is the land. And so looking at that and looking at Newport Beach land values, because that's another, every city's different, every county's different, every one of my analyses are different, is that I looked at it and said, okay, the maximum reduction in land price that would need to be achieved to equalize would be 25%. The other measurement I looked at is how much would rents or sales prices, market rate rents or sales prices have to increase to then mitigate that impact. Now, I make the first point that you can't just raise your prices because you've had this impact, because generally developers will charge as much for their home or their apartment as they can get on the market. So it's not like, oh, I made enough profit, so now I'm going to stop. But this is just a measure to see how long would it take, in essence, for the market to equalize back out. I've done, over the last 25 years, I've done over 30 inclusionary housing analyses. And as I say, everyone is different, but they all have this impact analysis built into them as a means of testing the balance. So, based on the results, the other thing that was important about the analysis that we did, and as was mentioned a couple times, is, and you know this, is Newport Beach is comprised of many different sub-areas that have different types of housing being built at different price points, different sizes, different product types. So we split the city into, in this case for rental projects, into 4 sub-areas. They were from the focus areas that had been identified in your housing element, but then what we did is we further took those focus areas and said, well, now where are apartments actually being built? And so that's how we got these four sub-areas. The results of that analysis were, even though they all varied from product type, et cetera, it ended up being that within the range, a 7% low income requirement could be supported by our financial analysis. So that was our recommendation in our financial evaluation, was that a 7% low income requirement be applied. Then, as has been mentioned, when the state allowed you to do rental inclusionary, they also said you need to provide options to on-site production. You can't just say you must produce on-site. You must offer some other options. They can be difficult to use. They can have restrictions on how they're used, but there just has to be more than one way to do it. Almost every community I've ever worked in on one of these has included an in lieu fee, ranging all the way from any developer who wants to use the fee can use the fee, to a situation where you can only use it if the council says yes, and you've proven extreme hardship, and that is extreme economic hardship. So, and then anywhere in that continuum. What we've shown you on this slide here is the fee in 2 different formats. But if you were to take it to the prototype projects that we looked at, its ultimate dollar amount would have been the same for how much the fee was paid. So the first one is the in lieu fee per market rate unit, which is how you used to measure your in lieu fee in your old program, and is commonly used. The situation then is, because there are no affordable units in the project, they're all market rate, is that every unit in the project is subject to this fee. So for example, in the airport area, that fee would be approximately $37,000 per unit in the market rate project. I professionally think that methodology is flawed, because what it does is it doesn't take into account the size or values of different types of units. And so small units end up paying disproportionately more in an in lieu fee. Large units pay disproportionately less in an in lieu fee. And so what I suggest and what I recommend is, rather than doing it per market rate unit, is to measure your in lieu fee per square foot of either rentable area or saleable area. And then that creates a more equitable scenario where, again, then the small units are paying less and the large units are paying more. And that tracks also with value. So in this case, so it's the same, it'd be, with the prototypes that were analyzed, it'd be exact same total fee. But again, using the airport area as an example, it would have been $38.30 per square foot of leasable area in the market rate project. And that's how the in lieu fee would be calculated. So the same type of analysis was done for ownership projects. And again, different, if you, and as I think Jaime mentioned, the report is online and available, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it as well. But so when we looked at that, we had different product types in each of the focus areas. And so as you can see in that one, we actually came up with 8% moderate income for most of the focus areas, with the big difference being Newport Center, that focus group, and that's because just the values of the homes in the Newport Center area are so high that then the affordability gap between an affordable price for a moderate income household and then the cost of that actual unit ends up literally being millions of dollars for one unit. That's the size of the affordability gap. And so you end up in a position with, if you want to not be confiscatory, you can't apply an 8% moderate income requirement. And we came up in our analysis with a 5% requirement. And if you track that down, you can see that the in lieu fee per market rate unit is over $200,000 to fulfill that affordability gap associated with the requirement. And then if you translate that into an in lieu fee per square foot of saleable area, it's a little bit over $86 a square foot. So you can see it's dramatically higher than the other three focus areas. So, changing gears. So that was the Kaiser Marston financial evaluation. So what we wanted to do now was to give you some context of other communities in the area, in the general vicinity of Newport Beach, to show you what they've done with their inclusionary housing policies. And so I think the first thing that you'll notice on this table is that every single jurisdiction that's mentioned here on this table allows an in lieu fee payment under some circumstances. So not one of them does not allow an in lieu fee. The other thing you'll notice is that the fees really do range from 10 to 15% from these cities that we're looking at. I have a survey of 93 cities and counties in the state that I've been working on for years and that I update all the time. And it really does sort of the common range of inclusionary requirements falls somewhere between 10 and 15%, 10 and 20%. You have communities with much lower percentages and communities with much higher percentages, but that's really sort of the sweet spot of where the bulk of inclusionary housing programs are. And then if you look to the far right, you can see that, for example, Irvine, so your neighbor to the north, has a requirement that's 5% very low, 5% low, and 5% mod. So, so that's a 15% requirement. It's my understanding that they're currently considering updating that analysis and increasing the percentage, but they've not yet done that. We're going to talk more about Huntington Beach on the next slide, so I'm going to skip over that one for right now. Long Beach recently adopted their ordinance. It's been within the last year and a half at this point. So their requirement is a 10% requirement. Rentals 11% low, 10%, and ownership is 10% mod. And so as we go down, you can see that the requirements really are within this, again, the range of very low and low for rental and moderate for ownership generally. And if there's any questions on this slide, we can come back to it. So Huntington Beach. I worked on several of the ones in the last slide too, but I worked on Huntington Beach when they updated their ordinance a couple years ago. They'd had an ordinance, they'd had a policy since the early 90s and an ordinance since 2007. And so they went back and they looked at it again a couple years ago to change it to make it more usable. That was the primary objective of their update of the policy. And that was done with community engagement. That was also done with the Building Industry Association engagement. And they'd had a policy that had been in place for close to 30 years. And so it was clearly ingrained in the landscape. So it was accepted that there was going to be this affordable housing requirement. It was just, what was it going to be? And so when they came back 2 years ago, they came back with a 10% low-income requirement for rental, a 10% moderate income requirement for ownership. On the in lieu threshold, they set it at 100 units for rental projects. So you can see at the top of the slide, any project with over 3 units is subject to the inclusionary housing requirement. But on a rental project, any project up to 100 units could pay the fee by right. And the reason for that rationale was at 100 units, you'd have 10 affordable units. And the notion is that at 10 affordable units, you would have an owner or a property manager who understood how to manage and administer those units. when you have small projects that have this affordable requirement in the apartment realm, say, a 2-unit requirement, then you're going to have a mom and pop developer often who just doesn't have an understanding of how to manage or administer these projects. And so that was the rationale in Huntington Beach behind that. On ownership, the in lieu fee is paid by right for any project. And the rationale for that is the new ownership projects being constructed in Huntington Beach are relatively high-cost units. And so when you have these units that are well over $1 million unit, again, you end up with a very large affordability gap and a smaller number of units that you can create without being confiscatory, and that you have, in a sense, a lottery winner. So somebody got a $1.5 million house for $300,000. And so you got one unit, and it effectively cost $1.2 million to get that one unit. So the notion is when you have premium priced housing in the ownership side, if you can take an in lieu fee instead of having them produce on site, is then you can use those funds in your housing fund to help assist a project, normally a rental project that can use other funding sources to bring down that financial gap. And the benefit of that is then you have a developer who's a mission-driven developer who understands how to run an affordable housing project. As I say, these things vary from city to city. I have a ton of cities that require on-site production of ownership units. It just made sense in Huntington Beach to have it be an in lieu fee paid by right. So the in lieu fee in Huntington Beach is based on the per square foot of leasable or saleable area, and it's a sliding scale. So what it also does is the smaller the project is in unit count, so for rental, it starts at 3 units, it starts at $2.54, all the way up to 30 units, where then it's $25.36, and everything above 30 units is $25.36. That sliding scale is there in order to not disproportionately harm small projects, and then to get the fee up to where the baseline is, which is the $25.36, once you have a project of a good size. Same thing with the ownership project. It starts at $358, ends up at $35.80. They also allow alternatives, which you can produce the units off-site, you can dedicate land, and you could do off-site conversion or preservation. In each of those cases, then the requirement's higher than the 10% if you do on-site production.
Thank you, Kathy. So what we like to do now is just receive council feedback, and our goal tonight is to receive direction and feedback so we can move forward with a draft ordinance and start putting pen to paper with an actual framework if that's the council's desire. And so for discussion purposes, what we have on this slide here is kind of the beginning outline of an inclusionary ordinance that staff would recommend we start with. The ordinance itself is totally flexible, and we can change any of these components. But for discussion purposes, we believe the applicability should apply to all residential housing projects that result in a net increase in units. So, for example, if a developer demolished a 5-unit apartment building and built a 5-unit condominium project, the inclusionary ordinance would not apply in that case because there's no net increase in units. But if a 5-unit apartment building was demolished and a 20-unit project was constructed, then the ordinance would apply to that 15-unit increase. But it would also apply in the case of a developer demolishing a single-family home and building a duplex. So the ordinance would apply to that one new unit. In terms of the minimum percentage for this inclusionary requirement, we recommend that we do follow the financial impact analysis that was prepared by Kaiser Marston and not to exceed those percentages. So for a rental project, that percentage would be 7% for either low or very low. For ownership projects, that percentage would be 8%, with the exception of Newport Center, which would be 5% for the reasons Kathy mentioned earlier. In terms of, we do believe an inclusionary housing fee should be an option, but for rental projects, we recommend that threshold is 50 units or less. So any project that consists of 50 units or less, they should be allowed the right to pay an inclusionary housing fee. But for larger projects, we do want to encourage developers to actually incorporate affordable units within their project wherever feasible. And then for the reasons Kathy mentioned, we would recommend that an in lieu fee be an option for all types of ownership projects, regardless of the total unit count. In terms of the in lieu fee recommendation, we would recommend a per square foot fee based on rental or ownership. And although the analysis shows we can charge different fees in different geographical areas of the city, I think for simplicity and to make sure we're not coming in too aggressive, we would recommend adopting the lowest fee and apply that across the board citywide. And then we would encourage that the ordinance include flexibility through offsite construction, land dedication, and then offsite conversion or preservation of at-risk affordable units. And that concludes our presentation. We are seeking feedback, and then based on that feedback, we could then prepare an ordinance and then return to the Planning Commission and City Council in the public hearing process and receive additional feedback and public outreach. But that concludes the presentation, and I'll leave this slide up for discussion purposes.
Thank you, Jaime. We'll bring it back up here. Councilmember, Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill.
Yeah, thank you. This is really interesting. It also, I think, shows just how difficult it's going to be to reach the RENA numbers eventually down the road. And this is sort of the point that's been made repeatedly. I see Mr. Tucker out there. We talked about this over and over again at our housing committee. So I think, so a couple things. One, I've tried to find studies that actually show inclusionary zoning ordinances lead to more housing production. I cannot find one. So if one exists and folks are listening to this and can send it to me, that would be helpful. They seem to be the exact opposite. And there was a compilation of studies put together a year and a half ago by Manhattan Institute by a fellow named, not actually, like he's not a fellow, like he actually has that title, fellow named Connor Harris. And did a lot of research compilation, especially in California, showing that regularly this actually decreases housing production significantly across the board in almost all California communities. And all the California communities do offer the in lieu fees. So one of the things that I'm looking at this and realizing very quickly is, let's say we do have a rental unit. So someone comes in and says, hey, let's do 50 units. So if they said, hey, we'll offer 7% of the 50 units, it's 3.5. So even if we round up to 4 units, we're looking right now at an in lieu fee for the airport area, which would equal about $148,000. And then in Newport Center, you can almost double that, but let's just round up to, let's say 250,000. So now the city of Newport Beach, in response to someone coming in on a 50-unit project, is going to be receiving $148,000, so that eventually we can use that money to go build affordable housing units. I am not aware of literally any patch of ground in the city of Newport Beach that we could buy for $148,000. And this is not a knock on the financial analysis. I understand exactly what you're saying, and you're right. Every city is different. Newport's going to be very different when it comes to cost of dirt and the cost of construction. And I suppose as I'm kind of working this through, one of the bigger concerns I also have is even based on all of the studies that I've read on the compilation of studies, I should say, those were even based on a lot of those were done in the early 2010s and the 2000 to 2015 timeframe. And construction's only gone up because of a lot of the regulations that we've seen coming down from the state when it comes to this. So one of the things that's nice about having a 36-month period to kind of work this through is there have been a number of cities, to your point, that have been passing their own ordinances, Santa Ana being a very aggressive one, Huntington Beach being another. And being able to give them a little bit of runway to figure out how that's affecting the applications that they're receiving and what kind of the width and breadth of how many of the in lieu fees are going. I guarantee, I mean, I'm looking at this, and I'm not a developer, but it seems to me that every developer is going to walk in and give us the in lieu fee every single time. Am I wrong, Jaime? I mean, who would not do that? Unless they got the subsidy, unless they were able to get one of the tax subsidies from the state.
Yeah, I just wanted to just clarify one point. So if there was a 50-unit apartment project in the airport area,
Yeah.
and they opted not to include the 3 or 4 affordable units on site, they would choose to pay the inclusionary housing fee. That fee could be assessed 2 ways, either per market rate unit or square footage. But the easy way right now is to assess it based on the per market rate, which is actually approximately $37,000 per unit. So we take the 50 times 37,000, which would equate to like 1.8 million. I just wanted to be clear.
Okay, so that changes the calculation significantly. So the in lieu fee would be the entire project as opposed to just the 4 units?
Right. So the market rate per unit fee, it's essentially prorated. So the 50 units in that total project, that's kind of their share towards producing those 3 or 4, that 3.5 affordable units.
Wow. Oh, that makes it really prohibitive for, oh, I see. No, that's a huge difference. Oh my gosh, that's expensive.
If I could just jump in. Yeah, so, and as Jaime said, so what that does is it says the affordability gap for each affordable unit was approximately $470,000. And so that's how much, so if you just took the 4 units, it'd be 470,000 times 4, which is how you get to 1.8. It is always confusing when we show the 36,000. People always do exactly what you did, which is well, times 4, it's almost nothing. So if you reverse it, no, it's a lot, but it's just now your discussion is on the other side, as opposed to it's not enough, it's maybe too much.
So 1.8. Even with 1.8, I mean, what are we buying? Anyway, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of struggling with this in order to even give direction, because it's still, it's such a market distortion in a way that we've never seen before in the city, and trying to figure out how to make sure we're getting good project plans in here that aren't cutting corners in order to ensure that they're meeting these requirements. That's interesting. Okay. I'll hold off, but I mean, my preference, frankly, just on the upfront, my thought process is that it'd be nice, as we are moving forward on this, to see how some of these are actually playing out in some of the other cities that have already adopted it, and see, again, what kind of stock they're getting, how many applications they're even receiving based on this. Because there are some people who are trying out some pretty different approaches here, and I suspect they're going to see a reduced amount of development being offered. Because like last thing I'll say, like for example, Santa Ana, if I recall correctly, had so much development going on in their city before they adopted the inclusionary zoning ordinance, that they had already satisfied their RENA allocation before they even had a compliant housing element. So they're not even going to worry about getting more new housing unless, but other cities, like, although admittedly Huntington Beach might be an outlier in a lot of things on housing, it'll be interesting to see. So I mean, I'd like to kind of keep gathering information to figure out the right path forward, but this is, it's interesting, man. So, sorry, can you go to the red slide for ownership? So in Newport Center, if someone came in with a 50 unit and they said, hey, instead of doing the, the 3 or 4 units of affordable, it's going to be 218,000 times 50. Wow. Okay.
That's what could be supported. I think our recommendation was just take the lowest fee and apply it across the board.
Yeah. At that point, they might actually do the 4 very low, but at that point, we've got 4 out of what, our 1,200. Yeah, this is going to be tough. All right.
Thank you. Councilmember Avery.
Thank you. That's my question. Are we getting any real world feedback to numbers that are similar to this or scaled, not necessarily for our city, but what's happening out there?
Right. Well, so I did a informal study 4 or 5 years ago where I looked at 4 cities that had inclusionary. And there's no doubt there's a ton of literature out there that says inclusionary is really stupid and doesn't ever help. I'm not going to debate them as we sit here. There are 170 cities in California with inclusionary housing policies. I did 4 cities that have been in place for 10 years. I looked at them before and after to see if there was any discernible difference in what happened to building permits. And it was Pasadena, West Hollywood, Santa Monica, a 4th one. Anyway, I have it. There was no discernible pattern in what had happened. They went up, they went down. I looked at before and after. But there's so many factors that play into housing development that in terms of, cost has been mentioned, or prices, and just changes in the economy, et cetera, that the only point of that table was to just show it wasn't like there was suddenly just this huge dip in housing projects being proposed in the 4 cities. That being said, I mean, I think the key to doing an inclusionary housing policy that has a chance of working is to moderate the requirement. So to not create a requirement that creates a constraint to housing. And then it just becomes a policy matter. I mean, you don't have to do inclusionary. There's no requirement for you to do inclusionary. It's just every city in California got nailed with a really big RHNA in the 6th cycle. And just to play back to the Santa Ana example, that's absolutely correct. They had finished their whole RHNA, but then they got the new one. And so they're starting over because the 6th cycle they got a giant RHNA, and they've changed their policy in Santa Ana every time the council's changed. So, I've done a lot of work in Santa Ana on changing inclusionary housing policies. As I mentioned, Huntington Beach has had it since 1991 in one form or another, and so it's been built into the landscape. And there have been a number of projects that were required to provide it in ownership housing, and it happened. Or there have been a lot of projects that paid the in lieu fee. And then the in lieu fee was then used, and Huntington Beach had redevelopment, which Newport Beach didn't have and nobody has anymore. But then, so they took the money in their affordable housing fund and used it to subsidize dedicated affordable housing projects that got low-income housing tax credits, primarily. So that's normally how it worked. Long Beach is relatively new, so that's fair to say, let's just see what happens. Irvine, through the Irvine Company, et cetera, has had inclusionary again for probably close to 50 years. And they've done their affordable units in a variety of ways. They've either done them as projects next to projects, or they've done them as fully affordable projects, et cetera. So, and I can give you the example on the other side, which is Goleta, who I always like to mention I had nothing to do with, is they made their requirement really onerous. So they have an extremely low income requirement, a very low income requirement, a low income requirement, and a moderate income requirement that add up to 20-25% of the units. That, I think, in my opinion, is clearly a constraint to housing. So I think that the idea, if you want to do inclusionary, which again, you can or you don't have to, is the idea is to balance these two interests, recognizing that just like any other impact, it is going to impact the economics of housing development. It just is.
Right. I think it's important to stay in touch with the development industry as you do this and get a lot of feedback as to what's doable, because all of us in this town know developers. I mean, this is a developer's town. This whole town was built by developers, essentially, and they all live here still. And one thing I've learned is there's risk involved with doing any kind of development. And, turning the economy, as you mentioned, just the cost of building, just being able to get materials in a time like this, it's really tough. And I think any developer will tell you they need to see a home run, just on the face of it, to have the confidence to go in and do a project, which almost every project has unforeseen issues and that are a threat to it as well. So if we really want to make this work, we've got to find a way to sweeten the pot. It's a very difficult thing to do with land values being what they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Avery. Councilmember Wygant.
Yeah, thank you guys for that nice presentation. Jaime, you mentioned a March policy deadline, and but then you were just saying you have to do one, you don't have to do one. It's up to you. What?
It's a policy action that was adopted as part of our housing update. So it is in there, and we will have to report annually to HCD how we're progressing on meeting that policy. But ultimately, it's at the discretion of the council.
To do this ordinance or not? Okay. So how many Orange County cities have completed their RENA? We were number 10 or so. Have
13.
So is the state really focusing on those getting addressed first before addressing, what the action plan is for the cities who have been successful?
I'm certain that's the case, yeah.
My thought on this is, this is a lot to swallow this evening, and your next steps on here was council feedback, then prepare draft ordinance, then send it to Planning Commission. I think it's a little premature with 4 new council members, including myself. Fortunately, I have a little heads up on this because I've been on the Planning Commission before, but I'm not really ready to see anything move forward tonight more than what Councilmember Avery was saying. We do have a development community that's pretty in tune with the city. I'd like to get some feedback, from a lot of experts before we really start pushing this forward and drafting something to send to Planning Commission. So I'm almost in favor of seeing this evening just kind of be a primer, and then maybe come back with another study session that, takes some of these comments. I mean, Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill brought up some pretty staggering numbers there, so that's interesting to see on that front. I have a lot of questions too, but the presentation was pretty helpful, answered a fair amount of them. But I think this is a lot to kind of come up with some type of draft this evening to then get in the works to send to Planning Commission. I think we should almost come back for another study session after this evening, and some time for us to kind of take the info that you've given us and doing some more research on it, and then having a better understanding in a second study session that then we can then kind of incorporate for that. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Councilmember Wygant. Councilmember Grant.
Thank you. That was very informative. A good presentation and a good overview. I first would agree with Councilmember Wygant that we do need more time to sort of let this germinate and maybe think through some of the bigger picture. It's disappointing to hear these big numbers and realize that they really don't even get us where we need to be. It's a requirement, but even at these sort of very large numbers that would be added to the construction costs, we still aren't going to have a satisfactory amount of affordable housing per the ARENA numbers. I'm curious, you did answer the question of how are the cities that have been doing this, how have they been spending their monies, and you gave some different alternatives. I understand that we had an in lieu ordinance before, and we did collect a lot of money at one time, which we clearly didn't use for those purposes. I know we used it for very good purposes in our city, but I guess what's the second, there's another piece of this is once we get those monies, really, what's the program after that? Is that like another whole study session, or are there, what are the requirements that we have in our housing element, or, how does that next step happen?
Sure. That's a good question. So as part of drafting that inclusionary ordinance, we would include kind of standards and guidelines for the use of the affordable housing funds, and similar to our past ordinance. In the past, the affordable housing funds could be used on really any wide variety of housing related programs. While we did have that inclusionary program in place, there were a number of projects that went forward, and there was flexibility, such as the Irvine Company's Villas Fashion Island. That was subject to the ordinance. But because it was flexible, instead of building units on site or paying a fee, they actually converted market rate units they had in a different project to affordable units, and we got 105 moderate income units that way. So it was flexible enough to where it didn't stifle development at the time, but we did collect a lot of in lieu fees. I think we collected up almost about $4 million. And so with those funds, we did help fund the Veterans Homeless Project over in West Newport, and that was 12 units. We also helped rehabilitate a number of units in the Seaview Lutheran Senior Affordable Housing Complex that we have. There's 100 units there. It was aging. They used some money to improve the unit to make them ADA accessible. And in exchange for that, we were able to negotiate a much longer affordability period. So we effectively have those now in perpetuity. And then we also have the SHARP program that's kind of managed by our Oasis division, and that's a senior home repair program to allow aging seniors to remain in place, and we just make improvements. So just an example of how funds can be used, and that's how we've used them in the past. But as we move forward, we would have to kind of set the stage for that framework for future funds.
Thank you, Councilmember Grant. Councilmember Kleinman.
Thank you. Thank you for the very thorough presentation, and it's helpful to have some of these graphics as well. I just want to kind of reiterate or emphasize what you said, Jaime, about the density bonus laws that are already in place. So those are by right at this point, and you kind of touched on it, but some of us have a little bit more in-depth information or knowledge on that. And we've seen some projects come forward taking advantage of that. So I think that's important to note, that is available already as a remedy or as a way to increase the opportunity for low-income housing. And then I'll just kind of echo what we've heard up here so far in saying that I think this is a lot of information, and I think the piece that we're kind of missing is that next step of practical application knowledge on top of this. You mentioned that you've looked at a lot of cities. Of course, Newport is unique, as you said, to those cities, but I think having that understanding of any measure that we implement and how that's going to actually impact not just development, but the type of development that we expect to see in Newport.
Thank you, Councilmember Kleinman. I just have Councilmember Wygant.
I just thought of one other thing too. Can the policy and the ordinance only do rental and not for sale, or is that illegal?
You can choose.
You can choose. Is there any cities that have done just for rental and not for sale units?
In my 93 survey, there's one. It's Glendale. They did just rental. But that's the only one, because until 2017, you couldn't do rental at all, an inclusionary, because of the Palmer decision, the court case. And so it wasn't until in 2017 when the legislature then said, oh, now you can. So rental hasn't been in the landscape for inclusionary housing for more than about 6 years now. Stopped in 2009 when the Palmer case happened, and then came back in 2017.
And then these percentages, the only one that is a variance and different is the Newport Center at a 5%. Could there be other areas identified that could be higher or lower and have more of a, up and down approach instead of across the board approach?
I wasn't trying to solve to the same percentage. It just happened. So it was just different product types, different costs, different sales price, different densities. It just happened. I mean, they're not all exactly 8%. There would be like 7.8 or 8.2, but within the four. But when we looked at the focus groups from the housing element, and then looked at what development has occurred in various parts of the city, it just happened, other than Newport Center, which is a huge outlier. And we didn't look at Newport Coast at all, right? So I think if you look at that, it just happened. I didn't expect that it would. It just did.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Just a couple of thoughts real quick. And I appreciate looking at the other cities and kind of seeing how we lay out with them, But that brings us to Newport as being kind of a geographical anomaly that, I think the reason we're looking at these four areas aren't because we're taking a slice of what we can do. It's that we have no real options to develop in almost anywhere else. We have villages everywhere else that are almost at full density of what we could possibly do. And so it really starts pulling pieces out of the market entirely for what we even have the ability to start doing. as we start mentioning some of them, I understand how Irvine has the ability to do it. You can just keep going closer to the mountains and keep building more. In something like Goleta, I think there's a lot of student opportunity there with UC Santa Barbara that's out there, and that gives you a little bit more ability to start looking at some of the other sides, which really kind of brings us back, to these ideas that, I think we've always been a fairly inventive city, and I would like to kind of keep that process alive, that a great way for us to find these units we're looking for is not necessarily to jump on right now and automatically start dropping in these ordinances to force developers, but to create the opportunity for how we can create a profitable venue in something like this. And, you mentioning Goleta brings that idea is, are there student housing options, or is there, retirement or senior housing options that can satiate some of these needs for some of this affordable element? And so this seems like, a broad sword on a specific approach that I don't necessarily think is necessary right now. I think it was Alexander Dumas that ended one of the longest books of all time, Hope and Wait. And I think that we're kind of at that point right now, that this might be a hope and wait time. I would love to see if we could continue these types of ideas and continue the conversation, but I can't get behind starting to throw these types of parameters on development where we're looking to kind of create a better city and more options for housing. And no point of this are we trying to get less options. We're very really trying to bring more housing within the city. And, the density bonus has worked. I mean, we've seen a lot of it in the airport district where we are actually increasing the number. Is it what the state wants? No, but, do we find that to be a bit of insanity? Some of us may. And so I think, the point that I'm trying to make now is I would really like to kind of wait and see, which has been echoed, I think, up and down the dais tonight. So I'll leave it at that, and let's go out to the public for some comments.
Mayor Blum, members of the council, my name is Jim Mosier. First, to echo the sentiment of the new council members, I think it would have been helpful on the agenda if it had been more clear that today's presentation was going to be a repeat of the one from last March, so that people could review what happened at the March meeting and know about the report being posted where it was and so forth, which you would not guess from the agenda listing. As to the presentation today of the possible ordinance summary, I have to say I did not understand exactly the terminology of the in lieu threshold and what the staff is proposing. I heard that for rental projects of 50 units or less, by right, the developer could simply pay the in lieu fee. I did not understand what happens if it's more than 50 units. Does that right simply evaporate and they have no opportunity to pay in lieu fees at all? Is it somehow discretionary? Is there a sliding scale? How does that work? I did not understand. And then my final comment would be, since we seem to have this ability to analyze construction development markets and how different scenarios will impact it, I did not see mentioned, or perhaps I missed it, do we now have a more clear and realistic estimate of the total number of units we will be obligated or expected to build in Newport Beach over the next 8 years to meet the affordable RHNA requirements that we have? And how the adoption of this possible ordinance would affect that? Would the total number be greater or smaller with this being enacted? But primarily, what is that number, which I assume is much bigger than the 4,835 and probably bigger than the 10,000 that was mentioned on one of the slides here? Thank you.
Thank you.
Evening, Mayor, Council, and staff. Adam Wood with the Building Industry Association. Thanks for the opportunity to comment. More than anything, I think I want to start off with thanking staff and the consultants for a great presentation tonight. This is obviously an extremely complicated issue. One point that I would add just for further context, when you look at these numbers up here as well, do remember that that's not your total impact. This is just for the affordable housing piece. You're still going to have other development impact fees that are increasing the total cost and burden on development. So this is just one sliver of the total conversation. And then you look at the housing market where we're at today. Interest rates are going up super fast. I know the industry is facing a real hardship. In fact, you're all invited. We've got our market forecast coming up in a couple of weeks where we're going to get a detailed report on what Orange County looks like. It's rough. It's dire. I know the industry is looking at layoffs across the board, so everything makes a difference. And when you talk about, interest rates harming, that leads to the affordability. So there's $218 per door, then you add on all those other things. So we're talking about significant numbers that are being at play here. Great examples were cited with other cities. I know, Santa Ana is actually a fascinating case study to look into. They were at $15 a square foot for their policy. And I know our guys, nobody entered the pipeline when it was at that number. It was a pretty hot market and no one wanted to touch it. And then they dropped it to $5. And you saw a significant shift, folks jumping in. So that's a long way of saying inclusionary is a great way to stop housing production, and that's something HCD is going to be looking at very seriously a couple of years down the road, where it's great to have the policy in place, but if nothing gets built, they're going to come back knocking, and I think there's a real opportunity to get out in front of that by studying this a little more. So thank you, and looking forward to working with all of you on coming up with something that works. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? Mr. Tucker?
Good evening, Larry Tucker. The Housing Element Update Committee had an affordable housing subcommittee, and one of the members of that committee was a guy named Paul Fruchtbaum. Paul was an affordable housing developer, and I asked him about inclusionary ordinances and what he thought about them and an adoption in Newport Beach, and he paused, said, well, it's going to be a very long, very deep conversation, and so you're seeing why. You probably shouldn't be providing guidance on this for a few months. You should be gathering information, especially from the development community, because the goal should be to get as many affordable units as feasible. And that might not be near what anybody has in mind. It's certainly not just picking a number out of the sky. They all have to be done on an economic basis. But we're not trying to be the best at affordable housing. We're just trying to be average. And average is going to be, making sure that we do have a certain amount of units built, because we don't want to be answering questions as to why we didn't do anything. So we have to do something, but the density bonus has been a very effective way of generating units. But you're probably not going to have that, for instance, in Newport Center. I mean, that's not going to be a 50 units to the acre times 20% or times 50% type of location. It's going to be a luxury location, and so the density bonus isn't going to end up working everywhere. One other point is the crummiest land in Newport Beach is better than the best land in most cities. So these units can be spread all over town or spread in certain areas of town, and they'll all be in nice locations in a great city. So I just think that you need to, if you're going to provide guidance on anything, I would recommend that you think about how you're going to get the information from the development community and from the community at large. Come up with a process for how you're going to have that information so that it comes to you in parts as you go along, and then all together so that you have an opportunity to start grasping parts of it, because this is just not the type of information that most people and most businesses, no matter how good of a business person you are or how smart you are, it's just completely different. So it's going to take a while. Don't get married to a calendar. You've got 3 years to get this figured out. So take your time and try to get it right. And not every other city is going to get it right. I can assure you that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker.
Good afternoon, Mayor Blum and council members. My name is Nancy Scarborough. I've been following this quite closely for some time now. I read the entire 300-page Kaiser Marston study. It was great, and it's so nice to hear you speak about it in person, because I had a lot of questions after reading the 300 pages. It still wasn't clear. So I just wanted to point out and give a little bit of touch to reality. Brad asked the question, how does this apply to real life? Recently, the Newport Village project presented their proposal for 198 units. 9 of those were proposed to be affordable. That's 5%. If you applied that same calculation to all of the units that we need for affordable to meet RENA, which we have 45 total, of those 2386 are affordable. If you apply that same calculation, you end up with, at 5%, 27,726 units. That's a lot of projects to put in our city. We can't do that. So if you had a 15% inclusionary, you would have 80 projects that would be that same size. It would be 18,226 units. Still a lot. So this is really complicated, and it's complicated even more so by the density bonus and the possibility of in lieu fees, which could be used for 100% affordable projects that would click off a lot of our 2386 units that we need to have. I do like the idea of taking time to really think this through. We've got a temporary 15% inclusionary right now, and that's not going to go away until you all make a decision. But this is complicated, and it's very big, and it's not your fault. The state's given this to us in assignment and setting us up to fail. So thank you very much for the study, and I look forward to lots more discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Scarborough. Any other comments from the public? All right, let's bring it up here. And it feels like we have a pretty general consensus at this point that we'd like to spend a little bit of time to ruminate on this and come back with maybe some guidance to staff about where we can bring this in the future. Do you guys need anything else from us beyond that? Are we in agreement with that type of policy up here? Wonderful. All right. Now let's go to public comments on agenda and non-agenda items.
Mayor Blum, members of the council, my name again is Jim Mosier. First of all, regarding the agenda announcement about the closed session that you're about to hear, I wanted to thank the city attorney for adding an extra sentence explaining what it is he's going to be asking you about 2 ongoing pieces of litigation in Costa Mesa. I think that's helpful for the public to know what the discussion will be about. But what I really wanted to talk to you about is the opportunity that you have later on the agenda when you come back this evening to ask for things to be put on a future agenda, which I think the new council members, you actually are allowed to do that when you make announcements, because reading Stu News this morning, I think I saw a need for an agenda item. In his column at the top of Stu News, publisher Tom Johnson mentioned that he had seen notice of a hearing officer hearing scheduled for this Thursday, and he expressed a confusion or uncertainty about what city hearing officers do, and he asked one of you to clarify for him what that was. The response he got was, in most building code cases and in some code enforcement cases, it makes sense from an efficiency standpoint to have one person, hearing officer, adjudicate with an appeal right to the Planning Commission and ultimately to the City Council, from which Mr. Johnson concluded that our system that we have here is like a hearing officer being a judge, Planning Commission being like an appeal court, and you being like the Supreme Court of California in deciding these cases. The problem with that is it's not true, or at least it's not the way our current code is written, which is why you may need a future agenda item to clear up how hearing officers work. In particular, there is no instance I know of in which a hearing officer decision can be appealed to the Planning Commission. There are some, mostly in zoning decisions, where the hearing officer can be appealed to the City Council. This particular one on Thursday, though, has to do with the issue from 3 years ago. The City Council wanted to put a limit on how long construction projects could last. And in writing that ordinance, which like many is perhaps not crafted as well as it should be, the hearing officer grants the first 2 extensions, and beyond that, the City Council would do that. But when you read the actual ordinance, the hearing officer's first 2 decisions are not appealable to anybody. And it specifically says, the decision of the review authority, which is the hearing officer, shall not be appealable to any city body. So it's a very, very strange ordinance that the hearing this Thursday cannot be appealed to anybody other than a superior court. Yet if he granted the extension 2 times, then it would come to you, the City Council. There's something that needs to be corrected there, and perhaps the whole hearing officer scenario that we have needs to be reviewed. It would be a good topic for a future agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? You can come on up. Are you, please?
I would like these passed out, please. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mm-hmm. This is a study that was done on the birds, and I found it a very, very good study. Now, I was before the board before getting the spikes off of the statue down in Newport because it was killing the seagulls, and I'm happy to say that they're not being tortured anymore. But the problem now with the statue is that it must be removed and put in a graveyard with all of our other heroes. Our children should never have to bow down to a statue. And on the paddleboard day, when they go out on Ben Carlson, our lifeguards cannot have to do that. They have to go or they're not getting a check from Newport. And that's wrong to teach our children to do that. And I talked to Evelyn Hart before she passed away, and she informed me that they didn't even have a vote to put the statue in down there, that it was just put in. And I'm trying to find out how much money that the family has made on the statue on their dead son, because it is a business for them. And the city should not build a business for a private person. And that should be not there at all. It's causing a whole lot of animosity in the city. And I would like to get some feedback on that and when you're going to remove it. We do have cranes. We do have caterpillars. And if you need help, I'm available. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Wonderful. Mr. Harp, do you have a closed session announcement?
Thank you. The City Council will adjourn to closed session to meet with the city's real property negotiators regarding negotiations with the American Legion as it relates to the property at 215 15th Street in Newport Beach, to meet with the city's labor negotiators regarding negotiations with all represented and underrepresented employees, and to meet with the city's legal counsel regarding the litigation titled SoCal Recovery versus the City of Costa Mesa and Raw Recovery versus the City of Costa Mesa. And that's all set forth on the agenda under items 4A through C. And just as a note, City Manager, City Clerk, City Attorney will not participate regarding item 4B2 based on potential impact on their finances.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're recessed until this 6:30 regular meeting. call the meeting to order for the January 24th regular City Council meeting. Madam Clerk, roll call.
The record will reflect that all members of council are present.
Wonderful. Mr. Harp, do you have a closed session report for us?
I do have a closed session report. The City Council has authorized the City Attorney to file and/or participate in an amicus brief in the litigation that is set forth on the agenda under item 4C. The motion authorizing the action was made by Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill and seconded by the Mayor. All council members vote in favor of the motion.
Wonderful. Now is the time for the invocation by Dr. Jim Terrell, Center for Spiritual Living, Newport Mesa.
However you know God in your heart, however you know that spirit which expresses its love for all of life, join me tonight in blessing this meeting. There's an expression of love here. There's an expression of wisdom. Every person in this audience is now filled with that wisdom and that love, listening with joy as they hear all the business of this community expressed in perfect wisdom. My word is also spoken for the City Council, for each member is listening with peace, which brings patience in their heart, so they hear everything that is said clearly, and it helps them make their decisions easily. So I say thank you, God, and I also bless all of the members, the secretaries, the police, the fire, everybody who protects our community and serves it. So I say right here and right now, this meeting is a complete success, that each of us lends ourselves in a world of love and peace. So as I say, thank you, God, for this truth, I let this word go and be, and so it is. Amen.
Councilmember Grant, will you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, notice to the public.
The City Council of Newport Beach welcomes and encourages community participation. Public comments are generally limited to 3 minutes per person to allow everyone to speak. Written comments are encouraged as well. The City Council has a discretion to extend or shorten the time limit on agenda or non-agenda items.
Wonderful. Now's the time for council announcements or reports from council members on committee activities, and the time for council members to request an A1 item to be placed on a future agenda. Councilmember Kleinman, do you have any announcements or reports?
I do have a short announcement, report rather. I attended the ACCOC newly elected officials training and orientation on January 12th. And I'll also add I had an opportunity to speak to the speech and debate program participants at CDM High School over the weekend with Councilmember Stapleton, and I won't steal his thunder. I'll let him elaborate.
Okay.
Wonderful. Councilmember Stapleton.
Yeah, we had a finance committee on January 12th. Wasn't able to attend, but I heard it was well attended. I was at the ACCOC orientation as well, hearing from almost, I think, every agency in Orange County, and I was able to do that with Councilwoman Kleinman, Grant, Wygan, and myself. And I think maybe Councilwoman Grant will give a bigger update on that. But it was a great time. Got a lot of newly elected officials in the county, so it was good. On January 19th, we had our Boat Parade Awards dinner. So with the Commodores Club, the Chamber of Commerce here in Newport Beach, it was a roaring success. A couple hundred people at VEA. The city was recognized for their support. I did give our city manager a plaque or an award yesterday, so hopefully that will be somewhere in the city. But it was a great event, and it was a great time to show our appreciation to the boaters and the homeowners that decorated their homes. And like Councilwoman Kleinman spoke of, on Saturday, on the 21st, we went and spoke to the speech and debate team at CDM High School, and it was a great opportunity to talk about civic engagement for our next generation and the power of local government. So the future is bright. We've got some really good kids to be proud of here in Newport Beach. And lastly, February 2nd, we're going to have a water quality committee at 3 p.m. here at City Hall, and I look forward to my first meeting as the chair.
Wonderful. Thank you. Councilmember Grant.
Yes, I did attend, along with the other three new council members, the Association of California Cities newly elected officials training. And I think we all were in agreement that it was very well done and a good start for orientation for all of us. I also attended a 3-day orientation in Sacramento with the League of California Cities. I'm the City of Newport Beach's representative to that organization. It was for new mayors, council members, and some city managers attended as well. Both conferences provided a lot of very practical training, finance, legal, ethical, general policy operations for cities. So that was time well spent. In Sacramento at the Cal Cities orientation, it was a unique opportunity for me to meet with some of our representatives. I did have an opportunity to have conversations with our newly elected Assembly member Diane Dixon, formerly of this body. Also met with District 34 Representative Senator Janet Nguyen, and went a long way to understanding the efforts that they're making in Sacramento to enhance our communities. So it was a very valuable opportunity. And that's it.
Thank you. Councilmember Weigand.
I attended the Community Alliance for Bike Safety, otherwise known as CABS, at the district office of Newport Mesa School District. Trustees Carol Crane and trustees Michelle Bartow were in attendance and put together the meeting. There was representatives from Newport Beach Police Department and Public Works and the local Rotary Club. And we discussed proper helmet safety, potential bike rodeo, which we will now called now as a bike safety awareness event that we're looking to have in the future. So that's a quarterly meeting, but we're going to try to span that up a little more rapidly to have some benefit to the community. I did also attend with new members the ACCOC elected officials training, which is state required trainings that all of us are mandated to have. And since we are new, we are spent a lot of time learning about sexual harassment training and ethics training. So we're on the up and up here, and I applaud my colleagues who sat through those. I also attended a ribbon cutting for the Chamber of Commerce at Calaveras Mexican Restaurant, which is a new spot off Bristol, and I was pleasantly surprised with their delicious Mexican cuisine.
Councilmember Avery.
I have none.
Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill.
Just a few. So we had the TCA Board of Directors where I was reappointed as chair of the San Joaquin Hills Board. We had a good Finance Committee meeting. Friends of the Newport Beach Library will be donating a lot of money again because I was there for their $3 bag book sale, and there were a ton of people there, which is great. Hosted a Girl Scout troop I think they get their democracy badge coming to City Hall. So if you have a Boy Scout, Girl Scout troop who would like a tour of City Hall, a city council member will host you. And then spoke to all the kindergarten classes at NCS this morning, which my wife laughed at when she found out I was doing. But it was fun because they were learning about what a mayor does. And so I told them what Noah does. And then we've got coming up on the 9th, Speak Up Newport's Mayor's Dinner. Really looking forward to that. So if you haven't gotten your tickets, go ahead. Sold out. If you haven't gotten your tickets, too bad.
Thank you.
Not sold out. We still have some tickets.
And for myself, last week I was in Washington, D.C. for the annual Mayor's Conference, meeting with some of our representatives out there, advocating for some of the greater projects we have within this city, the very important ones to us that take so many years through our bureaucracy, but some dredging, some airport issues, and some sand replenishment. So it was a very informative time out there. And that is all. We're now on to matters which council members have asked to be placed on a future agenda. This is a non-discussion item. Councilmember O'Neill has asked council to consider adopting a resolution modifying City Council Policy A1 to require that matters which council members have asked to be placed on a future agenda be primarily focused on issues that directly impact the finances, property, authority, policies, or interests of the City of Newport Beach and or finances, property, or rights of the residents of Newport Beach. We have a vote.
By show of hands. That's unanimous, 7-0.
Wonderful. Madam Clerk, please read the notice regarding public comments on consent calendar.
This is the time in which council members may pull items from the consent calendar for discussion. Those are items 1 through 14. Public comments are also invited on consent calendar items. Speakers must limit comments to 3 minutes. Before speaking, please state your name for the record. If any item is removed from the consent calendar by a council member, members of the public are invited to speak on each item for up to 3 minutes per item. All matters listed under consent calendar are considered to be routine, will all be enacted by one motion in the form listed below. Council members have received detailed staff reports on each of the items recommending an action. There will be no separate discussion of these items prior to the time the City Council votes on the motion, unless members of the City Council request specific items to be discussed and are removed from the consent calendar for separate action.
Councilmember Kleinman, do you have any items to pull from the consent calendar or conflicts to announce related to items 1 through 14?
I do not.
Councilmember Stapleton?
None.
Councilmember Grant?
None.
Councilmember Wygant?
I do not.
Councilmember Avery?
I have none.
Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill?
I have none.
And I have none.
All right, I'll move the consent calendar with the amendments to the minutes in our packets. In the front.
Second.
Wonderful. And we have a second by Councilmember Stapleton. Wonderful. Let's vote. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go to public comments on consent calendar items. I'm sorry, Jim, that was my bad.
Mayor Blom, members of the council, my name is Jim Mosher. Regarding the consent calendar, I'd like to call at least the public's attention to your item number 14, which is a status report on the Planning Commission effort related to fractional home ownership. That is an issue that is of interest to many people in Newport Beach. And if they want to look up the report, which you will be receiving and filing, they can do so, but it's a very brief report, and it can be easily summarized, which is that on February 23rd, a subcommittee of the Planning Commission may be making a recommendation to the full Planning Commission regarding new regulations about fractional home ownership. And they may or may not do something about that, and it may or may not be coming back to you sometime. That is the full report. And the other thing I wanted to bring to your attention is item number 11, which is the Planning Commission action report from their meeting on January 19th. And I wanted to call your special attention to item number 3 on that agenda, which was their approval of some exceptions to the zoning code for a proposed new duplex at 704 East Oceanfront, which is adjacent to the Balboa Inn, hotel by the Balboa Pier. The Planning Commission granted a variance for that, which was, the grounds for that were a little bit questionable. They also granted a height increase, which is allowed if certain findings can be made. But the findings that need to be made are that by building to a greater height, the architect can provide a better design for the building that will have more open space, avoid blocking people's views, something of that sort. In this case, and it's the first time I have seen this in many years of watching the Planning Commission, the finding was set aside and instead the applicant offered to pay $30,000 to a city arts fund. I found that very unusual, and it's as if we have different rules for different people. If they're willing to pay something to the city, we look the other way. I think that is something that you might want to review, call for review, and actually the reason these reports are coming to you is so that you are aware of what the Planning Commission did and have an opportunity to call those items up for review. I think this is one that certainly would merit that, because the idea of being able to pay to play is something relatively new in Newport Beach. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on consent calendar items?
Yeah, I have a non-calendar item. Joe Farino, congratulations, Mr. Bloom and Mayor. Your dad did my portrait. Anyway, I just found our neighbors got together. We've just found out there's a building approved for 2224 Marine Avenue. It's a vintage. It's a 1936 vintage cottage converted into commercial.
There will be some time for non-agenda items. I don't think.
This is a non-agenda item.
I know this one's just for consent calendar right now.
Oh.
So I'll make sure to get you up there for the next one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments on consent calendar? Perfect. Let's go ahead and vote.
The motion carries unanimously, 7-0.
Wonderful. Now we're going to move into public comment on non-agenda items. So this would be a great time to have you up here, Joe. Thank you.
I'm a resident of Little Balboa Island. Neighbors got together. Some of us have been noticed that a building was going to be a new building was going to be put up. Some did not. I know it happened during the holidays when half the island's on vacation. The question is this is an historic downtown area of I don't think anything's new has been built since the 1950s, although there's certainly a lot of renovations. I went through the documents. I don't see a traffic study. I don't see the typical 8 to 10 units of parking per 1,000 square feet. And and I guess the question is there a coastal commission on this yet or not? Has one been? I mean, how does it get approved without all these elements? That's the question.
Thank you, Joe. It's a time for comments, but we'll definitely have someone speak to you about that. A pleasure. Wonderful. Any other comments on non-agenda items?
This is a non-agenda item.
Perfect.
Mayor and City Council. My name is Kathy Gilbert, and I just want to tell you that I'm part of a prayer meeting at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, and we pray for you. We pray for the city of Newport Beach. We pray specifically for you, the city leaders. We pray specifically for the children of our city. We pray for the homeless situation in our city. We pray for the loneliness situation in our city. And I have a sheet here. I put some copies in the back if you care to look at it. And we just want you to know that we're praying for you. And we are confident because God loves the city of Newport Beach, and we are confident that he answers prayer. And so I just wanted to inform you that that's what we're doing. We're praying for you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was a very nice comment on non-agenda items. Wonderful. Please.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Joseph Kogan. I live on Port Wheeler in the Port Streets community of Newport Beach. I moved here about 5 to 6 years ago. My wife, Jessica, was born and raised in Newport Beach. She attended Corona Del Mar High School, and we actually started playing pickleball about a year ago at the Bonita Canyon pickleball courts and really became hooked. I mean, we are obsessed with this sport. It's been great. Anyways, pickleball is really a great thing for the city of Newport Beach, as it brings really good people together. The atmosphere is a lot of fun. I see people of all ages come together. I see families playing together and youth that may otherwise be stuck inside playing video games. Kids are actually building communication skills with adults and seniors in our community. It's a positive atmosphere to be a part of, and what really keeps me coming back every day to play. During normal summer hours, it stays light. Stays light out until about 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night. That gives me plenty of time to arrive home from work and play for a few hours with family and friends. During the winter months, though, as you know, time changes. It's difficult to play during the week at Bonita Canyon because it starts getting dark around 4 or 4:30. I have to drive all the way to Tustin or Portola Springs in order to find lighted courts. Most cities around the area and the country have lighted public courts, especially for winter months. The Port Streets is the closest neighborhood to these Bonita Canyon pickleball courts. This past Sunday, I spoke with Matt Cooper, who's a resident of 1607, in Port Abbey, which is one of the closest homes to Bonita Canyon pickleball courts. Mr. Cooper loves pickleball and would love to be able to play at night with his family and neighbors at the Bonita Canyon courts. In fact, because there's so many people playing at Bonita Canyon now, the residents of Port Abbey have actually etched out a court in the street, perfectly aligned with the street light, and a portable net so that they can play pickleball after work and on the weekends in their street. We are not asking for lights to stay on all night, but I think it would be a good idea to have lights until a certain time that matches like a standard in other areas. For example, Tustin Legacy has public courts that stay open till 10 p.m., then the lights go out. Portola Springs, 9 p.m. on weekdays, 10 p.m. on weekends, and then they go out. It's not like it's going to be all night pickleball. But other than that, thank you. We really appreciate your time and consideration, and congratulations to all the everybody who won their recent elections and everything. So
Thank you all very much. We appreciate it. Next speaker, thanks.
Evening. My name is Dennis McGavick, and I'm a member of the Pickleball People. I wanted to say tonight that as big as pickleball has gotten, it's not going to slow down. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. You're going to have kids in school playing pickleball soon, if they're not already. Some places I think they're starting. And we have kids coming out to the courts when they can get there. But, you know, they can only get there when they can. We've got so many women playing pickleball now. And it's just growing and growing and growing everywhere. And it can help pay for itself as well. For those of you who might have know about the Newport Beach Tennis Club, where they have quite a few pickleball courts now. They're putting on big tournaments bi-monthly instead of, it started out once a year, because they found out they were making so much money doing that. And this, Tustin, the city of Tustin is putting on pickleball courts. San Clemente, pretty much everyone around us. And it can pay for itself. If we had lights, we'd be able to get the people who actually have jobs out to play pickleball because they want to play the game. I'm lucky that I'm retired, and my age is getting up there, but I'm staying young, and that's why. I'm a retired golf pro, and I can't play a lick anymore, but I can play pickleball. So we're going to have, I know we're getting more and more kids out there, and they're already good, you know. So if we can get lights at the locations that we already have, then that'll keep more people playing. And if we start putting on tournaments, then it'll start paying for itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please. Welcome.
Honorable Mayor and Council, my name is Jackson Creamer. I am a 7th grader at Mariners Christian School. I live in Bonita Canyon community, which is a short 5-minute skateboard ride to the pickleball courts at Bonita Canyon Sports Park. In the past, if I was not at school or playing a sport, I would spend my time on electronics. However, since I started playing pickleball, I no longer spend time on electronics. Instead, I spend my weekends and some days after school at the Bonita Canyon Sports Park, playing pickup games with people in the community. I love that people of all ages, young and old, play together. So many people love playing pickleball that there is usually a line. It is unfortunate that we are forced to stop playing at sunset. If Bonita Canyon Sports Park added lights to the courts, more people in the community would be able to enjoy the game. I know even my dad would like to go after work if that were an option. The only courts in the Newport Beach that have lights are private clubs that charge a membership fee. I'm coming here today to ask the City Council to add lights at the Bonita Canyon Sports Park with the benefits of all people of the United Newport Beach. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor, council members, I wasn't going to speak, but I just got to tell you how this came about. I'm with the Bonita Canyon Pickleheads Club, and we were playing it at Bonita Canyon about a week ago, and I said, hey, Jackson, what do you think about if we had lights here? He said, that would be awesome. I said, look, we're going to do a little civic engagement. We're going to go to City Hall and ask the City Council to put lights there. Are you on board? He said, yeah, I am. So he said, well, let me ask my mom if I can go. So later that evening, he texted me, and Mom said yes, and Mom's here, and thanks for her for supporting Jackson. And then I said, hey, Jackson, you want me to give you talking points regarding the request for lights? He said, no, I got it. And then he texted me the next day what he had written out. He wrote it himself. I didn't have to do anything with it. Said it's brilliant. And so kudos to this young man. You know, this is going to be lights for Jackson. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other speakers? Because this is actually the least amount of pickleball speakers we've ever had. And for three of us up here, we've been in here a long time and heard quite a bit about pickleball. So thank you. No, it's great. This was a good amount of speakers for pickleball. We're very, very thankful for that.
If I could add, Mr. Mayor, we have over 200 members in our Pickleheads Club, and we knew the valuable time that you have here, that we're just putting in a request. When there's time for us to have on the agenda, hopefully, we know that there's a whole process with the Recreation Department and the Parks Commission and Finance and all the rest. We know that understanding a little bit of the process that needs to go through. So when we want the crowd, they'll be here.
No, we really appreciate the four voices. Those were wonderful today. Thank you. Did you have something to add, Councilmember?
Real quick, have you all spoken to our rec department a little bit? Yes, no?
We have spoken on other issues.
Okay. So, hey, Sean, raise your hand. So back there, that's our Rec and Senior Services Director. Make sure you talk to him before you leave so you can have a longer conversation.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you all. Perfect. We're going to move on to public hearing items. So item number 15 is an ordinance number 2023-1 and resolution number 2023-4 and 2023-5, general plan amendment to increase the development limit for Bay Island.
So, Mr. Mayor, hi, so this is an item that was presented to you 2 weeks ago at your last council meeting. We had a noticing snafu, so we're back again for a public hearing. Happy to answer any questions. The applicant is here. We're ready to take direction.
I feel like we're probably pretty good up here. I think it's fresh on most of our minds, and so do we have anything that we need to add up here? No. Do we have any public comments that we need on here? Oh.
Don't snatch victory.
Cora Newman, representing Bay Island Government Solutions. Just briefly, we want to acknowledge that we're here again for a public hearing. We also want to make sure that our comments that were made in the January 10th hearing will be folded into the record from tonight's hearing. And we hope that we get another approval. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no more comments or questions up here. Oh, sorry, Jim. That was I don't know what I was doing.
Mayor Blom, members of the council, my name is Jim Mosier. Just as Coralie is repeating her comments from 2 weeks ago, I wanted to repeat a couple of mine and actually add one. First, I didn't get any answer to whether the city regards this hearing as one for a entitlement for land use. It is a matter with an applicant. So does the new modification to what is called the Levine Act apply, where the council members should recuse themselves if they received campaign contributions from somebody who would benefit from the application? It would be helpful, I think, to have an answer to that question. Second, I think, is unresolved still the question that was asked by one of the planning commissioners back in 1997, which is whether the intention at that time actually was for 25 units or for 24, because the application was tied into a parking structure. The parking structure had parking for just 48 spaces at a rate of 2 per dwelling unit. And so that seemed to be an inconsistency between the parking structure, which I do not know what its current state is, and the entitlement that as it's being interpreted here. The use permit allowed for 24 building areas and what it called the caretaker's residence. All it says about that actually in the use permit, you didn't get this, it was deferred because of bulk, but it's actually not that bulky. This was a report from 2 weeks ago. As to land use, it says each site designated on the map will permit the construction of one single family unit, and the existing caretaker's residence, which I do not know in 1997 if it was actually a residence or a clubhouse, and the tennis court are permitted as accessory units uses for the single-family units. And then it goes on to mention the 48 parking spaces, and it says 2 will be required for every dwelling unit, including any caretaker's residence, if one was allowed. So it's a little bit nuanced as to whether the entitlement is for 24 or for 25. And then the other comment I wanted to make, which I did not make before, is we're here today, we were here 2 weeks ago, because the staff seems to believe that the zoning code adopted in 2010 conflicted and overrode the use permit from 1997 and needs to be corrected. But this is not the only inconsistency, because if you look at the use permit, it also says the floor area limit on Bay Island is 2.5 times the buildable area, but the code adopted in 2010 reduces that to 1.75. So if one thing needs to be corrected, doesn't the other? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Do we have any comment on the Levine Act, or are we?
So, in regards to this item, no one has any issues with the Levine Act.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Move approval.
Wonderful. I have a motion by Councilmember Avery and a second by Councilmember Stapleton. Let's vote.
Prior to reading the vote, I'll read the ordinance title for Ordinance 2023-1, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Newport Beach approving zoning code amendment CA 2022-5 to change the development limit specified for Bay Island from 23 dwelling units to 25 maximum dwelling units. Councilmember Wygan. Thank you. The motion carries unanimously, 7-0.
Wonderful. Let's move on to item number 16, ordinance number 2023-2, a code amendment updating accessory dwelling unit regulations to implement council policy K4 and to comply with state law. Mr. Jurist.
Thank you, Mayor Blum and City Council Member Simone Georges, Community Development Director. With me is Jaime Murillo, your Principal Planner. We didn't know if the council had any questions or if you wanted actually staff presentation. We do have a PowerPoint as backup if you want us to go through it, or if you've already read the agenda item, we're happy to answer questions on this item. This is an update to ADU ordinance per state law and some of the little minor changes that we had.
How are we feeling about a staff report up here? Are we pretty good? Good? I think we're looking pretty good up here. Okay. We have any comments from any members of council right now? No, let's go out to the public.
Lauren's got a comment.
Oh, I apologize. No, please, Lauren. I'll come back to you, Jim. Lauren would like you to go first, Jim. So why don't we? Thank you. Public comments.
Thank you one more time, Mayor Blum and members of the council. My name is Jim Mosier. I noticed, although you say that you are all very well informed about this, that the presentation to you actually did not include a copy of the new state law that these changes are supposed to be implementing, nor does it include a copy of the minutes from the Planning Commission meeting where the Planning Commission discussed and made their recommendations, so that you can properly understand that. Regarding not having a copy of the state law, I would suggest in a case like this, and I don't know if it's clear to those listening, we're talking about new regulations related to accessory dwelling units. The state has put requirements on us that we have to ministerially approve applications, generally subject to standards that they have set. Those standards seem to be changing each year. So we have, this thing keeps coming back to you each year to accommodate, we think, those changes. I personally think it's very unwise for our staff to try to rewrite the state law. And we would be better off if we just, in our ordinance, said that we are complying with the state law with these few modifications. That would have the advantage that when the state changes their law, you would not have to change anything unless some of those modifications were invalidated for some reason. So these occasions would be rarer than they are. Also, as the Planning Commission said, they recommended you proceed with caution, because any change you make that inadvertently in rewriting the state code makes it more liberal cannot be rolled back. So if you make a mistake, you can't undo that. So it's really wise, I think, not to try to rewrite the code. But I do have a problem, and I think you should be aware of a change that you're making that is not required by the state law, which has to do with the allowable height of the accessory dwelling units. It's found on page 16-18, section 3. The current state law, which to me is much clearer statement of the height limit restrictions than this rewriting of it. The basic limit on accessory dwelling units is 16 feet. The state has changed that. In some areas close to transit, they're now allowed 18 feet and an additional 2 feet for sloping roofs. The staff is recommending to allow 20 feet for sloping roofs everywhere. I think they're misinterpreting the state code because that extra 2 feet for sloping roofs applies only in those areas near the transit areas. So where the state only requires us allowing 16 feet, this, if you approve it, will allow 20-foot accessory dwelling units everywhere. The staff says that that's not a serious change to me. To me, if somebody built something in their backyard that might be blocking my view, and we heard that we're allowing 20 feet when only 16 is required by the state, that to me is a big thing. And I don't think you should be approving that.
Thank you, Jim. Well, perfect. Councilmember Kleinman, do you have anything you'd like to talk about height and this ordinance?
Yes, Mr. Mosier, you took the words right out of my mouth, actually. But I did want to just first start off by saying thank you to our staff, in particular Jaime. Every time Jaime's got his arms around these state law changes, they come out with a new iteration, and then Jaime has to go back to the drawing board and spend countless additional hours to understand, digest, and then try to explain it to all of us. And I wanted to add to that Councilmember Weigand and I spent a fair amount of our time as well looking at this on Planning Commission as part of the ad hoc committee, and we did talk to kind of all the different parties and stakeholders to get a better understanding, both to encourage the development of these ADUs, but also look at how they could potentially be taken advantage of in ways that we may not have thought about. And we tried to kind of balance that in making recommendations. And then, of course, Planning Commission has made those recommendations to council today. But to Mr. Mosier's point, again, staff has done an incredible job of implementing everything that the state law requires. But in this particular case, I do agree with Mr. Mosier about the height for the detached units. And I understand the proposal from staff in wanting things to be more uniform and easier to implement for staff. And I'm usually very protective of staff's time and resource. But in this case, I do think we want to be more protective and really want to be mindful of these detached units that could potentially encroach on neighboring property owners, and we want to consider going with that more restrictive standard rather than allowing what the state allows for those properties that are close to transit centers, et cetera. That is my whole comment.
Mr. Mayor, so we did speak to Councilmember Kleinman. We do have a backup slide. If we can go ahead and put that on the screen.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Madam Clerk, sorry. We'll have to flip through many slides here real quick. Maybe if you could stop at what the code, what our proposal is and what the amendment could be.
Yeah, so I'll just go ahead and explain. So one of the changes in state law is directly related to the height for detached ADUs. So we have different standards. If the ADU is internal, if it's a conversion, if it's attached or detached, the standards vary widely in the complex code. So with regards to the detached ADUs, the height limit was 16 feet for all detached ADUs. The state's now changed that to say it's 16 feet for an ADU constructed in conjunction with a single family or multifamily unit. However, if that multifamily unit is multi-story, then you can go to 18 feet with the ADU. Regardless of if it's single family or multifamily, if the project's located within a half mile of a major transit stop or high-quality transit corridor, then you can go to 18 feet, and then you can get 2 additional feet if you need to try to match the roof pitch of the main home. So it's super complicated. It was our recommendation to try to simplify this and create one standard that captured all those scenarios, just to minimize errors in implementation of this code. So it was our recommendation simply to allow for detached ADUs, 18 feet for flat roofs, and then 20 feet if it has a sloping roof. So that was kind of the intent behind our recommendation. However, we can, I think, where is it? Here we go. Previously, we did draft the code consistent with the limits of state law. And so we do have language that we could, if the council desires, to swap out, which would mirror the requirements of state law and would have different standards depending on the different scenarios.
I'm sorry, where in the code, if I'm looking for this, where is this in the?
I'm sorry, on page 16-18 of the staff report.
Thanks.
It's
item 3.
Yeah, item 3, building height. We would replace this section with what's on the screen.
Okay. Eric, go ahead.
So the change would be relative to a major transit corridor. How many of those do we have in the city?
So it's... I have a slide. So this exhibit shows where the current major transit corridors are now. Those are indicated on the orange, the lines. And then the major transit stops are those identified in the circles. Currently, there's one identified kind of in the West Newport area near Hogue. But these maps will change over time, depending on changes to OCTA.
Could be less, could be more.
Definitely going to be
So there's
more.
a significant amount that's not touching this dark and light blue, which that would be affected. So you're asking for a sweeping code that would be implemented on the grayed out areas versus the baby blue and dark blue.
Correct.
I would support, I almost said Commissioner Kleiman, but Councilmember Kleiman's suggestions.
I'll support it too. You want to make a motion? I'm sorry. That's your job.
No.
I want to make sure I understood it before I started going down the path of supporting it too aggressively.
That's great. So we have the amendment to the code as written with Councilmember Kleinman's addition. Would you like to make a motion?
I would like to make a motion. Staff recommendations with these changes as we've just discussed.
Beautiful. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill. Wonderful. All right, let's vote.
Prior to reading the vote, I'll read the ordinance title for Ordinance 2023-2, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Newport Beach adopting Code Amendment CA 2021-5, amending Section 20.48.200 accessory dwelling units of the Newport Beach Municipal Code to implement Council Policy K4, reducing the barriers to the creation of housing and new state law requirements related to accessory dwelling units. The motion carries unanimously, 7-0.
Wonderful. Madam Clerk, will you please read the announcement for motions for reconsideration?
A motion to reconsider the vote on any action taken by the City Council at either this meeting or the previous meeting may be made only by one of the council members who voted with the prevailing side.
Are there any motions for reconsideration? Seeing none, we stand adjourned.